If you clicked on this video, you probably know that in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu united Japan under a new military government. But chances are you probably don't know much about what was going on around the same time in Hokkaido. Land of skiing, snow sculptures, milk, horses. An island on the periphery of Japan which in 1603 had yet to become part of the country. And yet it mattered. Certainly it mattered to the indigenous Ainu who called it home, but it mattered also to the new shogun. In 1604, less than a year after becoming shogun, Ieyasu issued a document formally recognizing the rights of the Matsumae family, who controlled the very southern tip of Hokkaido near present-day Hakodate. It laid out the following 3 points. 1. Anyone who comes to Matsumae to trade with the Ainu must get permission from the Lord of Matsumae. 2. Anyone looking to travel further north into Hokkaido to trade must also get permission from the Lord of Matsumae. But the Ainu may go wherever they please. And 3. No mistreating the Ainu. As you can see, the most important thing going on in Matsumae as far as the shogun was concerned was trade. In particular, trade with the Ainu. But what were they trading and why? In this video, we'll dive into the history of early 17th century Hokkaido by first answering these questions. And we'll do that using 2 very different sources: eyewitness accounts by European missionaries and an Ainu folktale. This period was also a time of dramatic change. We'll see how abusive trade practices and ecological destruction by the Japanese exacerbated tensions with the Ainu, and how those tensions boiled over in a violent conflict known as Shakushain's War, which changed relations between the two groups forever. Now, let's begin with a closer look at the Ainu and the Matsumae. You probably have some idea of who the Ainu are. The indigenous people of Hokkaido, or Ainu Moshiri, literally land of man. The Ainu were advanced hunter-gatherers, though they did practice some agriculture, who lived in small villages throughout Hokkaido and neighboring islands, namely Sakhalin to the northwest and the Kurils to the northeast. They were not a unified people, either politically or culturally, but groupings of villages along major rivers could form larger political units bound by kinship, and these chiefdoms were especially prominent in the early 17th century, when the intensification of trade with the Japanese encouraged Ainu to join together and protect group interests, such as access to hunting grounds. When we look at the lead-up to Shakushain's War, we'll see how competition between 2 chiefdoms could grow violent. Lastly, I should note that the people of Hokkaido had been trading with Japan for over 1,000 years by this point. In other words, this was not a first contact situation like with the arrival of Europeans to the Americas. Now, on the other hand, we have their trading partners, the Matsumae, the sole Japanese authority on Hokkaido, although their rise to prominence was relatively recent. Their founding figure was a general who helped quell a major conflict between the Ainu and Japanese 150 years earlier, so their ability to subjugate the indigenous population was at the core of their identity. With investiture by Ieyasu in 1604, their domain officially gained entrance into the new Tokugawa order. But remember, it only covered the southern tip of Hokkaido, or as the Japanese called it, Ezo, which was also what they called the Ainu. Now, the word may have originated in the Ainu language, but regardless of etymology, it was conventionally written using characters that mean barbarian. In another telling example of language use, Matsumae was also referred to as the land of humans, and the Japanese language as the human language, implying that the Ainu were less than human. But however much they looked down on their neighbors, the Matsumae depended on the Ainu. As Ieyasu's order suggests, administering the Ainu trade was their role in the Tokugawa order, their source of legitimacy. So, it's about time we took a closer look at this trade. Though documentary evidence for early 17th century Ezo is scant, luckily for us, there were 2 Jesuits who journeyed to Matsumae in this period: Geronimo de Angelis, born in Sicily, and Diogo Carvalho, born in Portugal. Now, you may be wondering, wasn't Christianity banned in Japan by this point? And the answer is yes, but as the Lord of Matsumae put it when De Angelis first visited in 1618, the shogun may have expelled the padres from Japan, but Matsumae is not Japan. As this quote implies, while Matsumae was a domain in the Tokugawa order, its belonging in Japan was rather ambiguous and would remain so for another 2 centuries. Now, during their brief stays in Ezo, both De Angelis and Carvalho saw Matsumae come alive with the annual arrival of Ainu traders. The Ainu men came in small boats along with their wives and children, residing in makeshift huts on the beach while in town. From eastern Ezo, over 100 ships arrived every year, bringing dried salmon and herring, live birds such as cranes and swans, eagle feathers which the samurai used as arrow fletching, and the pelts of various sea mammals, including perhaps the most valuable product of all, otter pelts, which were procured not in Ezo but in the Kurils, whose inhabitants, though considered Ainu, looked and talked different from the Ezo Ainu, to the point of being mutually unintelligible. From the west, the Ainu came bearing similar goods in addition to exquisite Chinese silks. These would have been originally obtained at Chinese trade outposts in the Amur River basin by various indigenous peoples, including the Ainu of Sakhalin, who then traded them to the Hokkaido Ainu. In short, the Ainu offered the Japanese a mix of practical goods which fed growing urban demand in Osaka and other cities, as well as exotic luxury items which appealed to the elite. And in return, the Ainu received rice, sake, clothing, and other daily necessities imported on the 300 boats which arrived from Japan every year. It may seem strange that a hunter-gatherer society capable of living off the land would want this stuff, but Japanese goods had become an integral part of Ainu lives. In fact, the use of iron kitchenware obtained from Japan, for example, is one marker which modern archaeologists use to define Ainu culture, as opposed to the other indigenous cultures of Hokkaido which preceded it. In addition to satiating basic needs like food and clothing, Japanese trade items also played important roles in the social and spiritual lives of the Ainu. Decorative items such as swords and lacquerware were prized as family heirlooms and functioned as markers of wealth and status. Sake was not only consumed as a common beverage, but could also function as a token of reconciliation to settle a dispute, or as a ritual offering to the gods, the kamui. If there was some sort of ceremony going on, you could bet that there'd be sake served in Japanese lacquerware. Now, we can get a fuller sense of what trade meant to the Ainu by turning to oral literature. Like other cultures who didn't practice writing, the Ainu passed down knowledge and stories orally. And while songs about the gods usually get the most attention, it's actually the more mundane folktales which are helpful to us, because traditionally this was the genre considered most historically accurate, so to speak. In fact, scholars have found characters in folktales who can be verified as actual people who lived in the late 1700s. Trade with the Japanese features prominently in these folktales. In some stories, the protagonist returns home loaded with riches and prestige, while in others he, and it is always a he, meets his demise in the Japanese land, often by poisoned sake, which the Matsumae did have a history of using against the Ainu. But overall, trade with the Japanese in these stories is a heroic act, and a true trading partner is always a friend. We can see this hero's journey play out in Silver Forest, Gold Forest, a folktale dictated and transcribed by 2 Ainu women in 1932. Our protagonist is an orphaned young man who one day asks to join the village leaders on their trade expedition. However, these leaders are a band of mean-spirited brothers, so despite promising to take the boy, they leave without him. Undeterred, he sets out alone, but not truly alone, because along the way he encounters a god who tells him how his father was the true chief of the village, a great hunter famous even among the Japanese, and a pious man who always left offerings of Japanese food and sake along with an inao when he went to trade. However, he and the boy's mother were killed by other Ainu who were jealous of their riches, which is suggestive of how trade could lead to competition and strife among the Ainu. This kamui bestows upon the boy a charm which will protect him from harm in the Japanese land. Once there, he walks about looking for someone to trade with and meets a friendly samurai, who calls out to him in the Ainu tongue. When the boy introduces himself, the samurai bursts into tears. It turns out that when the samurai was a young lad, he often played with the boy's father. The boy is invited into the samurai's hospitable home, where he is treated to plenty of food and drink. However, there's a higher-ranking samurai in town who's taking offense that this boy had the gall to trade without first paying respects and offering a present to him. So he teams up with the Ainu bullies from earlier to harass our protagonist and his new friend, demanding that they take part in a rigged game, with death as the punishment for losing. But just when hope seems lost, the boy's guardian deity steps in to save the day. In the end, our protagonist returns home loaded with riches, finds a pretty girl to marry, and lives happily ever after, maintaining a trading relationship with the friendly samurai for years to come. Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that we can't take this story, or others like it, as some sort of transparent window onto the past. There is no date associated with the story, other than the date it was first written down, 1932, a full 3 centuries after the time period we're looking at. So what can we get out of this folktale? Well, we can get a sense of how trade with the Japanese figured into the worldview of the Ainu, in particular, how they viewed their relationship with the Japanese. Notice how in the story there were good guys and bad guys on both sides. You had the older Ainu bullies who teamed up with the power-tripping Japanese lord, while the protagonist found a trustworthy friend and trading partner in the lower-ranking samurai. In other words, it's not an us versus them mentality. Another important detail is how the protagonist chose who he wanted to trade with, going with the friendly samurai over the high-ranking lord. This suggests that, at least as an ideal, trade in Matsumae was carried out on Ainu terms. And we actually have an anecdote recorded in a Matsumae chronicle which illustrates how this ideal could be put into practice. In 1615, an Ainu chief from eastern Ezo named Nishirakein came to Matsumae with otter pelts for his greatest patron, Lord Yoshihiro, including one as big as a bearskin. Even his own people had never seen an otter like that before. However, Yoshihiro was out of town for the siege of Osaka Castle, and besides, he had recently passed on leadership of the family to his son. But rather than force the Ainu chief to instead give his pelts to the current lord of Matsumae, domain officials respected his wishes and had them sent to Yoshihiro, who in turn gifted them to Ieyasu. But however much the Ainu still enjoyed the agency to trade on their own terms in 1615, that would change for the worse in the coming decades, with the development of what's called the Trade-Fief System, the first of 3 sources of growing tensions that we'll be looking at. In short, rather than letting the Ainu come to Matsumae to trade, the Matsumae began sending trade ships directly to the Ainu as a way for the domain to pay its retainers. Samurai typically received a salary from their lord in the form of rice, but Matsumae, ever the exception, didn't grow rice, partly due to the harsh northern climate and partly because they just didn't try very hard. The Ainu trade, along with industries like fishing, formed the backbone of the Matsumae economy. So in place of a salary, Matsumae retainers were assigned a trading post somewhere in Ezo from which they were entitled to collect the proceeds. Now, why was this problematic? Why does historian Kikuchi Isao call the Trade-Fief System a system of plunder? Well, now that the Japanese came directly to Ainu villages, the locals no longer had a choice of who to trade with. No longer could they travel to Matsumae and trade on their own terms like in the folktale, much less bring their goods to somewhere other than Matsumae. We know that the Ainu used to cross over to northeastern Japan to trade, but the last recorded instance comes in 1644. So they now had no choice but to trade with the Japanese who showed up at their local trading post, which meant that the Japanese could jack up prices or make outrageous demands, and the Ainu still had to trade anyway. And we do have testimony gathered in the aftermath of Shakushain's war, showing that the Ainu were being ripped off. Suddenly, the bales of rice they received for the same number of dried salmon contained a lot less rice. In other words, shrinkflation. If a single string of shellfish was missing from a bundle, the Japanese traders would demand that they pay 20 strings the next year, or even threaten to take their children. And the plunder wasn't just in trade. Some samurai also took the liberty of fishing in their trade fiefs, When one community of Ainu complained to officials that Japanese merchants with huge nets were taking all the salmon, they were beaten and called greedy. But the Trade-Fief System was only the first item on the growing list of Ainu grievances. Another major source of tension and pillar of the Matsumae economy was gold. When De Angelis visited Ezo for the first time, gold mining had only just begun in earnest. He noted how the Ainu seemed to show no interest in the vast riches buried beneath their land. By the time Carvalho visited just 2 years later, a gold rush was in motion. He claims that tens of thousands of people were flocking to Ezo from near and far, many of them Christians fleeing persecution. In fact, Carvalho himself came to Matsumae disguised as a gold miner, since it was the easiest way to blend in. While the Matsumae lined their pockets with gold thanks to the heavy fees they extracted from the miners, Ainu communities suffered at the environmental destruction caused by mining practices. Once prospectors identified a promising section of river, they would divert the flow and dig up the riverbed. It doesn't take an active imagination to see how this might disturb the salmon which swam upriver to spawn every fall, and which the Ainu depended on for food. To them, salmon was the fish of the gods. Though gold mining began in the Japanese territory, the mines moved further and further inland so that by the 1630s they had reached the Shibuchari River, near present-day Hidaka, the domain of an Ainu chief named Shakushain. But before we get to Shakushain's war, we have one last major source of tension to discuss, and that is falconry, a pastime that over the course of the Warring States period had become synonymous with power among the warrior elite. Warlords went hunting with birds of prey to assert their dominance and gave them as gifts to solidify alliances. This culture put the Matsumae in a privileged position, as Ezo was home to many fierce birds, and indeed they presented hawks to the shogun many times. Ieyasu in particular was apparently a first-rate falcon fetishist. But they could also make a pretty penny by selling them. At one point, proceeds from the hawk business made up over a third of the domain's revenue. These hawk trappers set up camp in Ainu territory, which itself likely caused tensions enough, but this was made worse by how they would force local Ainu to help transport captured hawks back to Matsumae, or even give up their pet dogs as hawk food. That the Ainu grew to resent these hawk trappers is suggested by the fact that of the roughly 300 Japanese murdered at the outset of Shakushain's war, 71 were associated with the hawk trade. So, we've seen how abusive practices under the Trade-Fief System, ecological destruction from gold mining, and the disruptive presence of hawk trappers all contributed to growing friction between Ainu and Japanese. This brings us to Shakushain's war. I've just mentioned the murder of hundreds of Japanese. That moment in the summer of 1669 marked the beginning of open hostilities between a coalition of Ainu led by Shakushain and Matsumae. But the conflict had a long prologue in the form of a drawn-out dispute over hunting territory between two Ainu groups, known as the Hae, who were more friendly towards Matsumae, and the Shibuchari, who viewed the Japanese with more suspicion, especially the gold miners whose activity disrupted the annual salmon migration up the Shibuchari River. Though this dispute had simmered for decades, things ramped up when the Shibuchari murdered a Hae man who captured a crane in territory claimed by the Shibuchari to sell at a local trading post. Notice how trade moving closer to home could exacerbate territorial disputes, because there's now a constant demand for trade goods, but not enough animals to go around. Further escalation came when Shakushain attacked and murdered the Hae chief at a Japanese mining camp, kicking off a wave of tit-for-tat violence between the two groups. Now, the catalyst that transformed this inter-Ainu dispute into an anti-Matsumae offensive was the death of someone on the Hae side who had gone to Matsumae to ask for military assistance. He was denied and then died of smallpox on the way back. But Shakushain seized the opportunity to send out a call to arms to Ainu across Ezo, stoking fears that the Matsumae had actually poisoned the man and planned to kill every last Ainu next. This resulted in the murder of hundreds of Japanese traders, hawk trappers, and gold miners. And soon enough, Shakushain's men were knocking on the doors of the Japanese territory, prompting Matsumae to send out its army. Or rather, since there weren't enough samurai to fill out an entire army, more like a motley crew of retainers, gold miners, fishermen, and whoever else they could recruit, including Ainu. News of this clash set off enough alarm bells to elicit a swift response from the shogunate in faraway Edo. After all, the official title of the shogun was Barbarian Quelling Generalissimo, so it was his job to, well, quell the barbarians. And remember, insofar as Ezo was not part of Japan, this was an issue of foreign affairs. In fact, there were fears among top officials that the Ainu might team up with the fearsome Manchus, who now ruled the continent. So in response to this threat, the shogunate ordered northeastern domains to mobilize and dispatched a force of its own. Within a couple months, Shakushain surrendered. But in classic Matsumae fashion, he and other Ainu generals were murdered during a celebration of the peace settlement. So what do we make of Shakushain's war? It's tempting to view it as an essentially ethnic conflict, a fight for Ainu's survival to expel the Japanese from their homeland, and certainly there was that dimension. According to the sources, there was hateful and even genocidal rhetoric thrown around on both sides. But that characterization starts to show cracks when we take a more nuanced look. For example, we know that there were at least some Japanese who sided with Shakushain, including a gold miner who was his son-in-law, because they were executed in Matsumae after the war. More significantly, although Shakushain sent out his call to arms far and wide, from Sakhalin in the west to the southern Kurils in the east, not all Ainu answered the call. Why not? Well, it all comes back to trade. The war made abundantly clear just how important trade was to everyone in Ezo. As shipments from Japan fell dramatically due to the turmoil, Matsumae residents were forced to try their hand at farming, and even the lord's men were reduced to eating porridge of seaweed mixed with millet. But however inconvenienced those in the Japanese territory were, the Ainu had it much worse, thanks to the trade embargo put in place by Matsumae as punishment. One group was in danger of starvation after an entire year without a Japanese trade ship. Another was so desperate to trade that they parted with a bounty of animal pelts and eagle feathers worth far more than the amount of rice they received in return. When being cut off from trade with the Japanese could mean going hungry, it's easy to see why some Ainu communities may have felt that joining Shakushain wasn't worth the risk. We also have to remember that the Ainu weren't a single group. Noticeably absent from Shakushain's coalition were those at the far edges of Ezo. The Ainu of Soya and Nishiri to the northwest considered the ordeal a nuisance, while the Ainu of Kushiro and Akashi complained that it wasn't fair for them to be punished with a trade embargo when they hadn't joined Shakushain's cause. On a perhaps relevant note, when Dutch explorers looking for precious metals made contact with an Ainu community at Akashi in 1643, they were told by the local chief that silver and gold could be found to the west in the Tokachi region, but that he couldn't go with them because the people there were enemies. That region happens to fall squarely within Shakushain's chiefdom. It's also significant that Matsumae influence grew weaker the farther north or east you went. Ainu living in the far reaches of Ezo didn't have to deal with the gold miners and hawk trappers, and some of them continued to enjoy relative freedom for an entire century after the war. So in summary, the Ainu did not present a united front, and it's hard to imagine that all, or even most of them, would have wanted to expel the Japanese entirely from their homeland, given the importance of trade to their livelihoods. In this view, Shakushain's war seems less like an existential struggle and more like a desperate protest against Matsumae's oppressive policies. It was to be the largest outburst of anti-Matsumae violence in the Tokugawa period, and also one of the last. Matsumae used the opportunity to double down on restrictions. After the war, officials went around demanding compensation from Ainu leaders and forcing them to swear an oath, the key word of which was obedience. The Ainu were to obey Matsumae orders no matter what, and treat the Japanese with respect, whether they be officials on domain business, hawk trappers, gold miners, or traders. And they were now strictly forbidden from trading with other domains. While in practice Ainu may not have been making the crossing to Japan for decades by this point, there was still a desire to do so. The Ainu of Ishikari, for example, expressed a desire to trade directly with Hirosaki and Akita, like in the old days. Now, to some extent, the crackdown cut both ways. Matsumae forbid hawk trappers and gold miners from residing in Ezo, acknowledging their role in causing the conflict. A couple decades later, Japanese were being thrown in jail or banished from Matsumae for trading illicitly with Ainu who had crossed into the Japanese land. What was once a tentative line dividing Matsumae from the expanse of Ezo solidified into a proper border complete with guard posts. But this did not mean that Japanese encroachment on Ainu land had come to an end. On the contrary, it was only just beginning. Though the tidal waves of colonialism and capitalism were still little more than ominous ripples, when the gun smoke cleared after Shakushain's war, one thing was certain. The Matsumae and their trading posts were here to stay, and no matter how imperious their new neighbors were, the Ainu would have to find a way to live with them.